Today we're going over my first updated power rankings since the preseason. Now that the May Melee has concluded, I thought I'd start a new tradition here on the channel. At the end of each regular season tournament, you'll get a new power rankings video to help fill the void. Just like my preseason video, this will be a comprehensive list that includes all 20 teams. If you're interested in more of a separate regional ranking type of system, then I recommend staying tuned until the end of the video. Something new I'll also be implementing is how many spots a team either rose or fell compared to my preseason rankings of them. Then, of course, when we do this for the June Joust, we'll be comparing to this month's power rankings. Oh, and before I forget, no, I will not be bringing up the new hero pool. This strictly has to do with what we've seen so far. With explanations out of the way, let's kick this off with the LA Valiant, who come in at the number 20 spot. Some people might argue they're like 19th because they took a map off Chengdu and did okay in their game against Philly, but teams like Vancouver and Paris basically follow the same formula, but better. The Valiant have been very slightly better than I envisioned, but nothing that warrants a higher placing. They have not done nearly enough to make me think they would be favored to beat anybody else in the entire league. They have an 0-4 record with the worst map differential. End of story. As we move on to the number 19 spot, we have the Vancouver Titans. Sure, they technically have more map wins than I believe 4 other teams in the league, but as I've said before, a bunch of those came against opponents who were, in my opinion, not taking the Titans all that seriously. Might as well mess around and try some stuff out if your victory is all but assured, am I right? Maybe you think differently about what they've accomplished so far, but I personally am not buying it. I truly do believe every other team in the North American region is better. If Paris can beat them, I'm pretty sure anybody else can too. At the end of the day, they're still a winless team who have not even come close to getting their first victory. They're lacking any true firepower, so 19 is where they stay. Number 18. The London Spitfire. Some of you might argue London deserves to be 19th for showing slightly less fight overall than Vancouver, and honestly, that's a fair argument to make. The Spitfire's play was pretty sloppy during the May Melee qualifiers. This especially goes for that first week of games. It got to the point where KSF was even dominating them on Tracer because Dante had to go to the emergency room and all, and that's not a great look overall when you consider that he basically had no practice on the character. Houston were the better team, yes, but still, that is a little bit sad. But thankfully, the Spitfire did pick it up in their next week of qualifiers as they made both Toronto and Boston earn their wins. And I would say both of those games were very winnable. The Boston game literally went to a map 5, and the Toronto game very well could have too had London not C9'd on Havana. They showed that their synergy helps make up for some of their weak points, and that is why I believe they would beat Vancouver and the Valiant at the very least, hence why I have them at number 18 on this list. Number 17, the Guangzhou Charge. It's kind of funny to me that the Charge somehow played below my expectations, which was kind of low to begin with. In all honesty, they could probably defeat a fair amount of these bottom tier NA teams, but I don't know for certain because 3 map wins in 4 games is pretty darn ugly. And all of those map wins came against the Valiant, which is not doing them any favors. Nothing seems to be clicking with this group currently. Any opponent not named the Valiant gave them more than they could possibly handle. Regardless of how good they quote-unquote really are, poor results are still poor results. Number 16. The Paris Eternal. Since they're a bottom team, I'm not sure that a ton of you really care, but this still might be seen as controversial because 3 of their map wins did come against Vancouver of all teams, and 1 was while playing a Houston team who clearly were messing around a little bit. It might be slightly too high for some of you, which I find understandable, but they gotta go ahead of Vancouver in my opinion since they beat them, and I find the results more impressive than that of London and Guangzhou. Again, it's by the slightest of margins, and in reality they might be worse than both of them, but they do have a tiny bit more going for themselves currently, and they have a new main support on top of that, so I feel kind of comfortable keeping them in this spot for the time being. Number 15. The Boston Uprising. Another team who played a bit lower than my expectations. I had no choice but to move them down a few slots because they have a lot of work to do. Inexperience, a weaker roster, and a lack of confidence in their play on multiple fronts was very apparent. However, they did get better as time went on. Their win against London, yes, it was sloppy, but they still got it done, and I think their loss against Washington showed that teams do have to respect them at least a little bit. Being unprepared for them could result in a much more challenging series than you'd like it to be, but regardless, they still do have a long way to go before they're a serious threat of any kind, which is why they're a bottom 6 or 7 team for me as it currently stands. Number 14. The New York Excelsior. Yeah, I admit it, I rode the hype train way too much. Maybe I should have lowered my expectations a bit until I saw the results. Despite all of the rumors of them being really solid in scrims, they failed to show up when it truly mattered. The only time they were winning anything at all was in the Spark game, and that was Week 2 Spark, aka the Spark team who had yet to make any coaching changes or implement Shy into the starting lineup. If they were to play the Spark again, I don't know if they beat them. The only other teams I could see them defeating currently are the Charge and Valiant. The NYXL feel a lot like Boston to me. They're very interchangeable in my power rankings. The NYXL are not yet capable of beating any of the higher-ups, or giving them much of a challenge for that matter. Their youth has not provided the boost I thought it would. I thought they'd give teams like Seoul and Shanghai a decent fight, but when you have no maps to show for it, you can't really reward them that much credit. I still believe they could get better with time, but for now I have to keep it real and place them where they deserve to be. At the number 13 spot, we've got the Hangzhou Spark. They're lower than my preseason placement, but that might not last forever. There's no guarantee that they take a massive climb in the standings, but all I'm saying is their level of play improved as time went on. You could really see the difference that a different head coach could make. They no longer felt so lost and clunky and slow out there. Benching Godspeed for Shy was absolutely huge, and I think Gushwei was proven to be a much more reliable main tank than Takoyaki. The dives felt way more coordinated, and the team as a whole, they were firing on all cylinders. Going from barely taking a map off New York to taking Shanghai to a map 5 deserves credit. That's a very impressive turnaround for a 1-week span of time. They figured something out heading into the break, and that could make them a threat. But regardless, a 1-3 qualifier is still a 1-3 qualifier. They still have to improve more if they plan to get back on the right track. Number 12. The Atlanta Reign. The boys in red find themselves getting a 3-spot boost despite the 1-3 qualifier, because if I'm being honest, they weren't bad at all. A 1-3 stage easily could have been 4-0 or 3-1 if they were just a bit better at finishing opponents off and making strong adaptations mid-game. The Atlanta Reign showed me extreme proficiency and confidence on rush comps. They gave each and every one of their opponents everything they could handle on that particular composition in the mirror match at least, which is saying a lot. Their schedule was not easy at all. San Francisco and Florida, they're both upper tier teams, and Toronto, they're like high mid tier, and they're pretty even with the Reign overall. Guys like Pelican and Iris, I think they played at a pretty high level, and the rest of the team seemed to find their groove at least on Rush. The issue was that their opponents were more flexible in all of those losses. They got forced out of their comfort zone a ton, and that proved to be a major problem. Anytime they had to play something else, the level of play drastically decreased. The Reign are a decent team, but they're very one-dimensional, which is why I can only place them as high as 12th. Next up, at number 11, you've got the other boys in red, aka the Toronto Defiant. It may seem weird to have them this low despite their 3-1 record, which is totally understandable. If you think they should be a bit higher, you're not going to hear me complain. But in my honest opinion, they're not better than any of the teams I have above them. As of right now, I see them as a gatekeeper. They're the barrier that stands between the decent teams and the elite. They're like near the top of my good but not great teams. They've done a lot of good, but my main problem and gripe with this team is that they have yet to beat anybody noteworthy or give them much of a challenge. The Atlanta win is something I give them credit for, but they had to fight and claw their way to a win. Their other wins were against Vancouver and London, both of whom are bottom tier teams. Being unable to take a map off Washington and Florida shows they still have a long way to go. At the number 10 spot, I have the LA Gladiators, who find themselves taking a 6-spot drop. They failed to play up to my expectations early on. That's a big reason they find themselves here. Yeah, their losses were to the Shock and Fuel. No shame there at all. It's the way in which they lost that is the problem, though. For a roster full of stars, they certainly weren't always acting like it. I appreciate the dominance against Boston and London, but nobody's going to take you seriously if you cannot make any noise whatsoever against the big boys. And that's the problem, right? They're supposed to be one of the big boys, but instead, they failed to even make the knockout rounds. I have faith in them to turn it around, but that does not change their status here in the present. They got totally outplayed down the stretch in their losses, and that is something we cannot overlook. In my opinion, their tanks proved to be a weak point at times in those losses, and if they don't improve fast, the Gladiators will continue to get outclassed in these games they could realistically win. Number 9, the Seoul Dynasty. I kind of see them as the APAC version of the Gladiators in a way. If only they could beat a top team, they would be in business. You'd have to take them super seriously. But at the same time, I personally had lower expectations for this group. So the fact that they're around Gladiators level tells me that they deserve a slight bump up in my rankings. Overall, they've been pretty decent. Unlike last year's product, they won the games they're supposed to. But at the same time, they're still losing the ones you'd expect them to, so in a sense, they're basically the exact team I thought they'd be, but they're benefiting from a few teams playing a lot worse than my preseason expectations. So long as they stay in this state where they can't beat the good teams, they won't be moving up in my rankings anytime soon. Number 8. The Washington Justice. Okay, before anybody potentially freaks out on me for dropping them 5 spots, hear me out. For the most part, it doesn't actually have to do with their performances. The only exception to this is the Florida loss because they did show signs of weakness in that particular game. But it more so has to do with other teams simply playing better and elevating their levels of play beyond my expectations. A handful of teams played far better than I ever thought they would while pulling off some impressive feats along the way, so Washington were bound to get moved just like a few other teams that we'll talk about a bit later. Seriously, no disrespect at all to the Justice here. They're very capable. Magus lived up to the hype, Decay is still a beast, Bebe and Closer aren't bad. It's everything you could have asked for if you're a Justice fan. I give them bonus points for beating a Dallas team who were a week off a hot streak as well. But they aren't the most well-versed at Rush. Florida proved to me that top teams are going to give them trouble in that particular mirror match until further notice, and with Rush being so relevant in the NA region, that could be a problem in the future once Reinhardt and everybody else becomes meta again. Number 7, the Chengdu Hunters. I give this team a lot of credit. They truly defied the norms that have been haunting them for years now. That classic inconsistency they're known for has all but vanished. This iteration of the Hunters is different. They're more versatile. They can play the meta while still being an absolute nightmare on Wrecking Ball at the same time. They're no longer that team you only have to worry about in a certain month of the year. They're scary all the time. Their record, plus a May Melee Final Four appearance, is worthy of high praise. They're off to a great start, and I think beating Seoul and Shanghai is wonderful. So many of their players have made strong contributions. Life is good if you're a Chengdu fan, but not winning a single game in the Final Four showed they aren't quite at the top of the food chain. Taking maps off Dallas and Florida is a good start. Now they just have to push it a bit further. Once they do, I will gladly move them higher up. Moving on to the number 6 position, I have the Houston Outlaws. They move up a whopping 11 spots. That's pretty crazy. That's what happens when a team makes me look like a total clown. They were legit in the first 4 weeks. It's a long season and anything can happen, but a strong start like this gives you hope. So many of their guys are playing up to their competition. Janggu, Piggy, Crimzo, Juby, they've all made excellent contributions, which has made the lives of their star DPS players much easier. It's a very well-balanced team that managed to be one of only 3 franchises to have an undefeated qualifier. They beat 2 North American juggernauts, showing that things are different compared to previous years. But the real challenge has only just begun. Any team can get off to a hot start or take advantage of a certain comp. It's a long season, and some of Houston's strongest heroes are now on the ban list. If they manage to do well in this meta too, I don't think anybody can doubt them anymore. Let's see if they can pull it off. Heading into the top 5, we start with the Florida Mayhem. Kind of like with Chengdu, you could argue these guys deserve to be a bit higher thanks to how far they got in the May Melee, but I'm not fully convinced they deserve top 4 or better in the rankings just yet. People are quick to forget they have not been perfect. The qualifiers did come with struggles. Atlanta gave them a challenge, and don't you dare forget about their crushing loss at the hands of the Shock. And this may just be me, but I kind of feel like they took advantage of the Justice not being amazing at a certain composition. I can't say with confidence they're going to beat them the next time they meet, but despite my reluctance to place them top 4, they're still in a pretty good position. OG has been the exact opposite of a problem, while everybody else around him has basically picked up where they left off in Season 3. Yaki in particular has been on fire and is absolutely an early season MVP candidate. And I mean, despite some of the issues I've had with them early on, they still did take Shanghai to a map 5, albeit in a very weird situation where both teams were sloppy, and they beat Chengdu during the Final Four. I know I'm downplaying what they've accomplished a decent amount, but I only do it because they have not fully earned my trust when it comes to their consistency. But trust me when I say I believe Florida are a great team, and I'm more than happy to have them this high up despite the questions I still have. At the number 4 spot, I've got the San Francisco Shock. I get that the Shock have not been amazing so far, and it's fair to argue they're a bit lower than where I have them, especially because of their shortcomings so far. But I, for one, still believe in San Francisco. It's hard to go against a 2-time defending championship team with primarily the same core. I just can't do it. You guys saw what they did to Florida, and I honestly think they could have beaten Houston if they played them again, because the Shock pretty much never lose to the same team twice these days. I still think they're better than most of the teams in the league, but at the same time, I have to acknowledge that there's no way they could possibly be top 3 right now. It's hard to say they deserve it here in the present when they didn't even make it to Hawaii. While I don't think it's a big deal in the long run, they still were sloppy. Between the embarrassing loss to Dallas, a tough loss to Houston, and going 5 maps with the rain, there's plenty of proof that they are not where they need to be. They have to adapt and get used to their new roster. Because it was only one stage, I'm giving them a break, but if it does happen again, they're getting moved down further. Anyway, moving on to the first team who cracks my top 3, we have the Philadelphia Fusion. Yeah, they failed to make the Final Four this time, but let's be honest, if they play any team not named the Dragons in the knockouts, they're in, and who knows what happens after that. I favor Philly over Chengdu, San Francisco, and Florida. They've been more consistent than all of them. Their only real hiccup so far was against Shanghai, which is a game they came painfully close to winning. All it takes is one fight that goes differently, and we're talking about a completely different turn of events. The Fusion appear to be as confident as ever, and I would be shocked if they weren't a top team in the qualifiers yet again for the upcoming June Joust tournament. Their team is nasty. I mean, look at how they've done so far. Convincing wins against 2 of the better APAC teams, and a game they just barely lost to a Dragons team who literally goes clutch god mode in these types of situations and tournaments. Philly are legit. They're flexible and are full of stars. Going off all games, they are easily one of the best right now. As we move on from the number 3 spot though, at 2 we have the Shanghai Dragons. Things started off bumpy for this group, a lot bumpier than I thought it would in fact. That loss to Chengdu and that 5-map scare with the Spark was not a great sign, but as usual, they showed up when it mattered the most. In typical Shanghai fashion, they were a threat in a tournament atmosphere. Unlike some of the other teams who got hot, the Dragons are somebody you can fully trust here because they've been doing it for years now. No matter what they show in games preceding the tournament, they flip the switch right when it matters. It's not always pretty, but they always get it done. They're the one exception in this kind of situation just because they never fail to find relevance. They're always a team that's good when it matters, and that's something that I value a lot. They've never missed a regular season tournament finals before, and they have beaten some good teams to get there in the past and during the most recent tournament we had for that matter. And while they came up short both times, they did push the fuel harder than anybody else during their hot streak. The Dragons are still a top team. It's difficult to argue with their results. And finally, taking us home at the number 1 spot is the Dallas Fuel, and I mean, you all saw this coming. Sure, they went on a crazy hot streak and they only went 2-2 during their qualifiers technically, but there was never a time where this team was truly bad. There was never a game they weren't competitive in, and to top it all off, they're freaking tournament champions. They beat so many of the best teams in the league currently all in a row. It's hard to not label them as a top dog right now. Their style of play was very hard for all of the opposition out there to keep up with, and if they can make it work on characters they're not supposed to be great at, I don't see how a future meta change will stop them in any way or form. It feels weird saying this, but the Dallas Fuel, at least for right now, at the time of this recording, are number 1. They were the best in the Overwatch League through the first month. They have it all down to a science with their "we're not going to worry about what the enemy is playing" mentality. It also helps that many of their players are performing at a superstar level right now, if not MVP level. Most of their starting lineup has been insane, and I would argue a bunch of them have made a case as top players at their respective positions. And let's be honest, if Fearless plays like that, Dallas could beat literally anybody. He's getting value out of the main tank position that I haven't seen since Fissure played for the Gladiators in 2018. He's probably been even more impactful if I'm being honest with you though. So long as he plays out of his mind the way he has, and the Fuel keep finding creative ways to win, they're not going anywhere. They might not always remain at the number 1 spot, but there's a good chance they maintain that contender status throughout the entirety of this year. I know that some people are a little bit worried about what a certain hero pool could do to the Fuel, or if there's just certain balance changes that go into effect, but I'm not that concerned. I don't think they're going anywhere simply because of their coaching, and because of how great their players are at adapting and learning. But that's basically everything I have to say about the Fuel. Now, as promised, here are my separate regional rankings for those of you who prefer them over the combined one. It's pretty obvious why teams are in the position they are if you watch the whole video. The Dragons remain on top of Asia, with close behind them being the Philly Fusion, while New York plummets down to the number 6 spot. On the side of NA, Dallas are now the new kings, with Houston also rising a noticeable amount. The biggest winners of the rankings overall are Dallas, Houston, and Chengdu, who all moved up multiple spots in both rankings. Meanwhile, the NYXL, Justice, and Gladiators are your biggest losers, as they all saw a substantial plummet compared to their preseason rankings. And that just about summarizes my final points and arguments, so we're done here, ladies and gentlemen. What are your thoughts on my power rankings, and what do yours look like? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed today's video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe if you want to stay up to date with all of my power rankings content here on the channel. As always, thank you all for watching, and until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.